Our history is no more than a series of incredible events. Each one of us can influence its course. From the birth of a 1,000-year empire to the end of a flourishing civilization. From the creative genius of a handful of men to a global cultural revolution. From the darkest totalitarian visions to the most terrifying great wars. From the heroic resistance of an entire people to the unbreakable will of a minority. The tiniest of our decisions can influence the future of mankind. To know the past is to anticipate the future. October 12, 1492, west coast of North America. After an epic voyage lasting 67 days, with water and provisions exhausted, the explorer Fu Li is the first Asian to set foot on the American continent. In the name of the Principality of Peking, he declares himself viceroy of the new territory. For the Middle Kingdom, this is the beginning of a new age of conquest, in which each king demands his own slice of the cake. Asia is about to pounce upon the new world. Within a few centuries, on the very spot of the landing, on this arid landscape surrounded by mountains, a city of over 10 million inhabitants will rise. New Peking. But none of this ever happened. 2,500 years ago, the ideas of one man were to form the psychology of the Chinese people and forge the will of the greatest country in the world, China. "551 years before our era, the Lu region in ancient China. Confucius is born into a modest family. 57 years later, 80 magnificent women are offered to the sovereign of Lu, for whom Confucius is the minister of justice. In the 3rd century of our era, his disciples complete the compilation of his Analects. In so doing, they immortalize his thoughts. These 3 intimately connected events are the founding elements of the Chinese psychology. Their effects have been influencing the world for 2,500 years. China is one of the oldest countries in the world. It has survived through thousands of years, seen vast empires rise and fall, experienced invasions of barbarians sweeping in from the north, and of Europeans coming from the sea. Its origins are so ancient that they are lost in the mists of time. The ancient chronicles have been faded away with the passing of the centuries. And yet, China is still here, more present than ever, and appears set on conquering the world. Our story takes place more than 2,500 years ago, in a world where the Roman Empire didn't exist, where Alexander the Great was not yet born, and where the very word China had never been spoken. This is the age of legends, of great thinkers, and of bronze weapons. In this region of the globe, set between the Yellow and the Blue rivers, humans have lived since time immemorial. Thanks to the abundance of water and the vast fertile plains, civilization was able to take root and sustain itself. Massed around the rivers, the ever-increasing population, as in Egypt or Mesopotamia, had to swiftly organize and form hierarchies. As time passed, kingdoms, empires, and wars followed one upon the other. During the period that interests us, the political situation is very particular. China is divided into nearly 200 small, more or less independent states, and is under a political system very like that experienced in the West during the Middle Ages. Rivalry between the states is intense, and local wars between lords are not uncommon. In the middle, the central flower, a grouping of small, less powerful states, is the heart of power and is constantly striving to maintain the status quo. Technically, the country is not in civil war, but the situation may be described as delicate. This very special period is known as the period of springs and autumns.
Welcome to the memory of humanity. Here we can control time, analyze and compare billions of events, and alter them to rewrite history endlessly. For example, let us return to our distant past and explore civilization's first steps. China is a cradle of civilization, but not the only one. When humanity began, there were only scattered tribes living from hunting and gathering. By discovering agriculture, people not only settled, but moved closer to major sources of water. The more water there was, the more people there were. Gathered around major rivers such as the Nile, the Euphrates, the Tigris, or the Yellow River, people were forced to organize themselves to manage the use of the land and the water. Thus, the first cities were born, the first administrations, and the first states organized. Fields were used to produce enough to create reserves. One part of the population was able to specialize in warfare, another in the arts, in science, or administration. It was no longer a mere question of survival, but of building, developing, and learning. From the need to live together, the first great civilizations were born, but so also were the first great conflicts.
China, which does not yet bear that name, is divided into a host of states, all very different from one another. Some are fortunate enough to be ruled by enlightened sovereigns. Others toil under the yoke of cruel despots. Most experience a subtle blend of the two. It is one of these small countries, on the banks of the Yellow River, that our story begins. On this day in September, 551 years before our era, more than 2 millennia ago, Q is born to the Kong family. Many centuries later, his name, Christianized, will be known throughout the West as Confucius. At the age of 19, he chooses the path of administration and becomes intendant of his region's granaries. He then works his way gradually up through the ranks to become Minister of Public Works. Confucius is a born administrator. He is fair, upright, honest, and rigorous. For him, politics is not for personal advantage, but to improve the lives of the people. He is a statesman. His achievements and successes naturally earn him the envy and hostility of less talented or less honest civil servants. Throughout his life, he will encounter scheming and conspiracy against him, even going as far as attempts at assassination. His inability to confront them is proof of his integrity. If he is no longer wanted, he prefers to leave and take his advice elsewhere rather than to descend into dishonorable political maneuvering. Like every man of integrity, he will move from disappointment to frustration. His aspiration to create the ideal government turns into a quest. His aim is to find a sovereign capable of listening to him.
Men change with difficulty. All his life, Confucius stood out against corruption, personal ambition, and political maneuvering. He lived during a period when the governing elites were more interested in their personal benefit than in the institutions they managed. How are things in our time? Let us imagine a man with the wisdom of Confucius traveling from country to country, visiting presidents or prime ministers in order to advise them on how to run their countries. He would make suggestions to the President of the United States on how to manage his foreign policy, or to the Chinese government on media freedom. How would he be received? Which president would listen and really put his advice into practice? It's a safe bet that such a visit would remain purely symbolic and would have no subsequent effects. And yet a statesman is supposed to be in the service of others and put the interest of all before his own. Through the ages, down the millennia, human beings have always had the same needs: to feed themselves, find a place to sleep, protect their families. These basic needs drive them to react in a certain way, to prefer their own survival over that of others. If we took a 21st century man and placed him back in prehistoric times, he would quite certainly resort to tribal behavior and fight for his own survival and reproduction. The survival instinct is inborn, even in the most civilized of men.
Believe in man. That is Confucius's credo. The human being fascinates him. He believes man is naturally good and is convinced of his capacity to improve. He insists especially on the value of education. So he travels extensively, goes to the provinces to advise princes, to give them the recipe for good government, hoping that they will listen to him. Gradually, through experience, he evolves a sort of moral code, a line of conduct. Drawing inspiration from ancestral traditions, Confucius makes it into a rule for life that he never hesitates to teach. Very quickly, he gathers about him disciples who listen to him and contribute to the spread of his ideas. Progressively, the administrator promoted to princely advisor becomes a thinker. But it is while he is Minister of Justice in Lu Province that a major event in his life is to unfold. As always, his administration brings stability, morality, and wealth. The neighboring province is envious, and then worried by this, and devises a scheme to eliminate Confucius. Aware of the advisor's reputation for incorruptibility, its governors offer 80 of their country's prettiest girls to the sovereign of Lu, who neglects his duties for whole days at a time. Disgusted and disappointed, Confucius chooses to resign and takes to the road. This is the departure point for 14 years of wandering, during which Confucius will teach his many disciples his code of conduct. Dozens of years later, the code, written and compiled into collections by his disciples, is given the name of Confucianism.
We have just reached a turning point. A turning point is a key event, a crossroads in our history where the world swings one way or the other. Disappointed by the attitude of his lord, Confucius decides to resign from an important post and set out upon the road. He chooses to remain true to his ideas. At age 57, this is a major decision taken by a mature man. There's no doubt that this is a turning point in the life of the advisor. What would have happened if Confucius had remained at the Lu court? if he had put his values aside and decided to accept the situation. Perhaps the great thinker would have returned home, frustrated and in disgrace. Worse still, when his enemies saw him clinging to office, they might have chosen a more radical method of removing him. Without him there to defend them, his ideas would certainly have sunk into oblivion. The China of today would have been greatly changed. Imagine a China where the sense of collectivity, as desired by Confucius, was replaced by individualism, where the importance was placed on the happiness of the person and not on the good of the state. It would have been impossible for the Chinese government to use the philosopher's thoughts to make its people accept current working conditions. Western multinationals would have chosen another, more competitive country to set up their business. Made in China would be far less prominent than it is today. The balance of the planet as we know it would be totally different. Let's take it a little further. China itself may never have come into being. Split into a host of tiny kingdoms, each competing with the other, this region of the globe might have resembled Renaissance Europe. Less united, she would certainly have been more open to the outside world.
Virtue is within the grasp of all. Confucius was convinced of that. His thought is a humanist philosophy. Man is neither good nor evil by nature. The choice of his life belongs to him. Through learning, he can succeed in putting his faults aside and cultivating his strengths. But for the philosopher, education does not end with books. You must also develop one's talents through contact with experience and with life. Merely stuffing oneself with knowledge is not enough. An ideal prince is a virtuous prince. To govern, he has no need for violence or the death penalty. It is sufficient to set the example and the people will follow. A governor who cannot rule himself cannot rule others. But education is not enough. The human being also needs to respect another fundamental value: love and unconditional respect for parents and family. Within a political context, this respect becomes submission and absolute devotion to the prince, the king, or the emperor. This concept of filiation, which Confucius places at the heart of all human relations, is the keystone of his entire thought and will influence China for the next 2,000 years. After the death of the master, this teaching will be committed to writing in a collection known as the Analects, which has survived to our very day.
Ideas are mightier than weapons. What is Confucianism? A religion? A philosophy? The very definitions of the two terms are difficult to clarify. Across the world and time, there is such a variety that boundaries are blurred. For Confucianism, the most appropriate word is thought. Teaching rather than beliefs. Confucianism does not call on you to believe. It gives advice and a path to follow, a method. It coexists in the same territory as Taoism and Buddhism. The fact that the three spiritual disciplines cohabit proves their mutual tolerance. And yet, this spirituality inspired by a master is not exclusive to China. At more or less the same period in ancient Greece, Socrates is also teaching his pupils. Like Confucius, he writes no books himself, and his thoughts are spread by his disciples. Both thinkers were in search of a more just society, and both exercised massive influence over their respective civilization. These ideas, thoughts, and beliefs have modeled the way we view the world, understand life, and think about death. And yet they are no more than words. A few sentences spoken at the side of a road or under a tree. Without Socrates and Confucius, and also Buddha, Lao Tzu, or the philosophers of the Enlightenment, the world would be radically different. In good as in evil.
For nearly 2,000 years, the thoughts of Confucius have been a fundamental pillar of Chinese society. Taught to children, imposed on administrative executives. Nobody can pretend to an important post if they have not yet studied the works of the master. A real success for the ideas of the thinker. But, ironically, as so often occurs, this recognition did not come in his lifetime. Listened to, respected, set up as an example, he is, however, never really followed. Not one of the great princes he advises puts his ideas into practice. All take from his teaching whatever suits them, but they ignore the rest. So the importance allotted to respect for the Father and the Lord is largely adopted and expanded by successive kings and emperors. Sovereigns show great interest in this philosophy that puts respect for authority and blind obedience to the fore. Work on oneself, education, and the practice of virtue, more constraining, are less followed. Dying at the age of 72, he was buried by his first 72 disciples under a simple earth mound covered with grass. Today, this simple grave is surrounded by those of his sons and grandsons, spanning 76 generations, which makes it the largest private cemetery in the world, with close to 200,000 of the master's descendants. Confucianism is the backbone of Chinese thought, at least until 1860. From that date, the Chinese elites realize how far their country is behind the Western world, and they lay the blame at the door of dusty Confucianism. And so begins a slow process of deconstruction of the millennia-old philosophy. In 1949, at the end of the Civil War, Mao's communists take power and launch the Great Proletarian Revolution. Objective: eradicate all remains of traditional society and a Confucian thought. For 10 years, everything will be done to wipe the Grand Master from memory. But it doesn't work. The 1980s will see his rehabilitation for the same reasons used by the Han emperors centuries earlier. Absolute respect for authority. Useful in times of crisis. Now in fashion, promoted by the leaders, Confucius's ideas are again all the rage. However, would Confucius himself recognize his thoughts today? But that is another story.
Ideas do not die easily. An idea, that tiny spark, however minute or fragile it may be, can rock a kingdom or bring down an empire. The Christian religion turned the Roman Empire upside down. The Enlightenment revolutionized the West. Confucianism molded China. In good as in evil, ideas develop on contact with human beings. The more there are, the faster they go, like a trail of gunpowder. Over the centuries, many people have tried to change an idea, to subvert it to their own use, or even destroy it. And there's no shortage of weapons: manipulation of opinion, destruction of monuments, burning of art, banning of teaching, execution of thinkers, massacre of populations, genocides. Any method will serve to prevent the spread of an undesirable idea. Confucianism was fought for nearly 100 years. The authorities tried to wipe it from memory, to make it disappear. But you don't get rid of 2,500 years of history by burning a few books. After being set up as an example, Confucius was attacked. But nobody, however powerful he might be, can prevent another human being from thinking what he wants. Our consciences belong to us. Our memory is our treasure. And that nobody can take away from us.